I recently happened to watch Arun Bastani's interview that was 1 year old. It was with the two right wingers, Constantine and Francis Foster. And I was surprised. Many critics might have noticed that he did not mount a very effective defense, especially to the question when Francis asked him if socialism had performed, or he clearly said that socialism has failed, it didn't work. So it has to be seen when these right wingers talk about socialism and its effectiveness or its failures, they do not take all factors into account. For instance, if we talk about the history of modern Soviet Union, that started with 1917, but that of the United States started in 1776. Since 1776, the United States has militarily intervened more than 223 times, according to Naval Historical College of the United States in different parts of the world. They would go to Haiti as if they are going from Washington to New York. They carried out many interventions in Latin American country, declaring it their sphere of influence, and they hardly lost a lot of lives during First and Second World War. But when we talk about the history of the Soviet Union, it started in 1917 with the United States did not recognizing the government for until 1933 in some cases, and the world more or less um, did not recognize it until 1926. Soon after the revolution, more than 10 countries' armies invaded the Soviet Union, triggering a civil war that claimed, according to some statistics, 7 to 12 million people's life. And Encyclopedia of Britain claimed it was 10 million, and 2.3 million had already been killed in the First World War. So it is more or less 12 million people who lost their lives. And when Germany attacked the Soviet Union, 86% of Russian coal fields went under her control. One third of Russian population or Soviet population was also under the German control, and 26% railways also went to Germany. And the situation more or less was the same when the Soviet Union, in a way, forced by the circumstances to strike a deal or enter into an agreement with the Soviet Union. On the other hand, if you look at the losses of the United States, only 117,000 people got killed during the First World War. Compare it with the people, around 12 million or more than 12 million people lost their lives in the First World War and the Civil War in the aftermath of the First World War, in the aftermath of the Soviet Revolution. So imagine if 12 million people had been killed in the United States. 86% of its coal fields had been captured by its enemies. One third its population had been under the control of its enemies, or 26% of the railways had been under the control of the enemies in the United States. What would have been the level of economic development? Despite all this devastation, the Soviet Union did try to make strides in different fields, and during the Great Depression, during the decade of 30s, when the world was struck by Great Depression, there was no Great Depression in the Soviet Union. The economy was developing by leaps and bounds. At some times, with registering the GDP growth of 12%, 13%, even 20%. The average GDP growth during the 70 years has been 5%, which is tremendous. Then during the 1930s, it somehow started standing on its feet, despite the fact that there were declared or undeclared sanctions on the Soviet Union. It could not freely operate. Of course, it was a backward country in 1917. It did not have a lot of industries. It did not have very high literacy, and it needed technology. That's why the Soviet Union wanted A similar socialist revolution in Germany that did not take place. But whatever achievements the country had witnessed, they evaporated during the Second World War when Hitler invaded the country. And during the Second World War, the world witnessed more than 70 million deaths. Out of those 70 million deaths, 27 millions were the Soviet citizens. Some statistics even claim 40 million. But let's take the conservative estimate, which runs between 20 to 20 to 27 million people. 34,000 industries of the Soviet Union got destroyed. In addition to that, war experts say that if in a war one person gets killed, on average, 5% get injured, including those who suffering from post-traumatic effects. So imagine a country losing 27 million people, uh, another around 50 million people might have got injured in one form or in one way or another way. 34,000 industries or industrial units were destroyed. Despite all that, in 1956, the first industrial country of the world was the United States, and second was that of the Soviet Union. It sent, people in space, dog and women, and it also developed like in the defense field, coming up with tanks, excellent tanks and all that, and of course making atom bomb and hydrogen bomb, which is not good, but it did to counter the threat. And the Soviet Union was not only developing itself, it was also extending help to others. For instance, in China, 22,000 Soviet advisors were there in 1949, or after that first economic plan, 5 year economic plan of China was developed in consultation or in collaboration of those advisors. It extended, according to some estimates, it extended more than 500 billion dollars subsidy to Eastern and Central European countries, supporting revolution in Vietnam, in the in Cuba and other parts of the world. And when the country witnessed its fall in 1991, the life expectancy that was hardly 37 in 1917 had risen to 62, 67, or more than even 70 in some regions. Literacy that was hardly 19% in 1917, or less than 19%, it had almost risen to 100% or 99% or 92%. It is interesting to note that in the entire Islamic world, the only countries that were under the control of the Soviet Union had achieved 100% literacy or 92% literacy or 95% literacy. And Soviet Union was supporting all decolonization. It was supporting liberation movement from African National Congress to Palestinian Liberation Organization. It was materially supporting tens of thousands of students from third world countries were getting education in Soviet Union free, and they were even being given a stipend. The Soviet Union supported Cuba in its initial year, refining its oil, buying its tobacco, sugar. It extended help to Poland. It provided Pakistan with the largest steel mill of the country. It also helped India with the steel mill and other thing, and helping out India with its own industries. So, as Alan Wood and Ted Grant mentioned, that it was the planned economy, the miracles of planned economy, that helped Soviet Union sustain for 70 years. So we can have differences, or there could be debates about, Stalin's the way Stalin ruled over that country. There are statistics like the Russian Nobel Prize holder claiming that 110 million people were killed, with the Black Book of Communism claiming 100 million people were killed. But there was a historian who believed that 1.4 million people were killed by historian Victor Zemekov, something like that. So he mentioned that there are some estimates that even suggest lower than this figure, but it was basically the black book of communism that talk about 100 million, which many people believe is exaggerated because Russian population may be 140 million during the First World War, Soviet Union population during 140 million or maybe less than that. So if 12 million people had lost life in First World War and then 100 million had lost in Second World War, then how would we justify the population of Soviet Union in 1950s or 60s, which was still more than 100 million. So not only in the Soviet Union, if we look at uh, China, we have so many differences, and of course, Mao's policies could be condemned in many ways. But again, in China, same was the case. The life expectancy in that country was hardly 36, 37 in 1949. Literacy was very low, and economic development was almost non-existent. The most of the country was agrarian or uh, backward. Most of the countryside was backward, and even during the time of Mao, from 1949 to let's say 1979, even after the death of Mao. So if we compare that time, life expectancy increased from 36 to more than 60 years. Literacy, which was hardly under 20%, that had also witnessed a tremendous surge, crossing more than 50, 60, or 70%. The average growth during that time was 5%. And this was despite the fact that there were so many sanctions on China. So, despite all those sanctions, China did demonstrate tremendous strides in uh, different walks of life and fields. Let's take the example of Cuba. That Cuba has been under sanction for more than 60 years now, in one way or another way. There were assassination attempts on Fidel Castro, and despite all that, it is the one of the most educated country of Latin America. Life expectancy also improved in Cuba, like other socialist countries, and it has least child mortality rate. It is among the countries that have least child mortality rate. It has managed to control or prevent transmission of HIV from mother to babies. Even some of the advanced countries have not been able to do that. Now coming back to Venezuela, in Venezuela's 26 million, more than 26 million population, many people would simply lose their eyesight because they could not afford a very insignificant surgery or very cheap surgery. Chavez, you may criticize him, extended that facility to millions of people, preventing them from losing their eyesight. His supporters say that he opened up, utility store types things or stores where people could buy at cheap rate. He tried to address the problems of people living in slums, and this was despite the fact that the country was under sanction, and there were attempts on him. There were military coups against him, although he held a number of referendums. So many critics might say that he was one of the most democratic leader. And what Constantine and perhaps Francis Foster overlooked was the factor, the losses that Venezuela had to face because of these sanctions. For instance, according to Council on Foreign Relations, between 2017 and 24, Venezuela suffered a loss of $226 billion. Can you imagine such a huge amount? To give you a sense, only $50 billion, according to UNDP, is enough to extend primary healthcare, primary education, sanitation facility, and pure drinking water to more than 100 countries. $5 billion is enough to wipe out extreme poverty from entire Africa. $50 billion, 50 billion euro is enough, or maybe a bit more now because this is an old statistic, for the damage, for to repair the damage that has been caused to ozone layer because of our activity. So these people, when they make analysis talking about Soviet economy, imagine if 27 million people had lost their lives in America during the First World War. America hardly lost 400,000 people, right? If 34,000 industries had been destroyed in America, would it be, or would it have been in a position to rebuild it itself within 11 years as the Soviet Union did? As the Soviet Union did. The United Kingdom lost around 400,000 to 600,000 people. So compare when they make economic analysis, they do not want to see that this country that was devastated in 70 years two times, losing almost 37 million people, witnessing destruction on an epic scale, supporting liberation movement, decolonization, subsidizing Central and Eastern Europe and many other countries. So how can you say that socialist economy did not work? Socialism did not work? And along with this all, they also attained 100% literacy. Education was free from class 1 to PhD level. The Soviet Union produced the best engineers, best doctor, best scientists. Yes, we can debate why it collapsed. Naturally, it invested a lot of money in non-productive sector of economy. It pumped billions of dollars into defense. Like at one point during the Second World War, some historians say that it's the strength of its army, including volunteers, everyone stood at 5 million. That's a huge number. And then 5.6, 5.4 million people, the best minds, the best engineers, scientists, astronauts, and experts, they were affiliated with defense industry. But the Soviet Union cannot be held responsible for this alone. Of course it shares the blame, but it was the arms race triggered by the West. And when Reagan started Cold War, there were estimates, and there were, of course, expectation that Soviet Union would also try to follow the Star War, and this is how economy will get weakened, and this has exactly happened. So when these people make an analysis, like today, if you are making an analysis, let's say of any country, let's say Syria, that has lost more than 150 million because of the damage caused to its infrastructure. It lost 500, more than 555,000 people. Now we can see, or we will see in future, how many years will it take to rebuild itself. So when they all make economic analyses, they do not want to take into account the devastation that was witnessed in the Soviet Union during the 70 years. So I think Arun should have mentioned the achieved of socialist economy, the Human Development Index. Of course, there are differences. We can talk about the killings or the brutalities of Stalin, but on the other hand, the Western people or people in colonies also paid a heavy price for the uh, industrialization of the Western world. For instance, more than 50 million, 55 million black were dragged from the African continent, forced to work like animals. More than millions of indentured labor from Ireland and other parts of Europe were brought to America. When Christopher Columbus landed there, the population of indigenous people ran into millions. Some with some estimate, suggesting more than 120 million. Some people say 159 million. 95% of them were decimated. In the same way, millions of black also lost their lives during that uh, process of industrialization. And as Howardson has said, there could not have been any industrialization in Western Europe and North America if there were no plantation, and there could not have been any plantation if there were no slavery. So, of course, in Soviet Union, people had to pay a heavy price for industrialization, but the same could be said about Western world as well. Like the UK was accused of plundering or looting $45 trillion from India alone, committing brutalities in Kenya, India, and other colonies. France did the same thing in Algeria, Indochina, and other parts of the world. Shashi Tharoor accuses British colonial government of being responsible for more than 35 million people who lost their lives in famines. And many Indian authors, some authors go to the extent of accusing the colonial British government of being responsible for more than 100 million deaths that occurred during colonial times and within a short span, not the entire colonial time. So, of course, that could be debated, but the socialist economy's achievement cannot be forgotten. When they talk about Venezuela, they have to take into account that the sanctions that have been imposed on the country have caused a damage of more than $226 billion. And even when Chavez was not there, again, according to some reports, more than $100 billion embezzlement was committed before Chavez came into power, before 1997. So when these right wingers talk about these countries, they ignore sanctions, they ignore devastation that was caused in the Soviet Union during First and Second World War. They ignore the fact that wherever revolution took place, the country was immediately put under sanction, and counter-revolutionary forces were supported there, as was the case in the Soviet Union. And because of that intervention, Soviet Union lost 7 to 12 million people. So how can you ignore these facts when you are making an economic analysis? Do these factor not influence economy? Do they not influence the way you make progress in economic fields? So I think Arun should have mounted an effective defense, and I'm sorry to say that he could not do so. And the right wingers, posed that questions, and the way he should have defended uh, the achievements of socialist economy, he did not. So it was a bit disappointing.